Welcome to season 3.5, episode 5 of Read by the Author. I am here again with my co-author, Lindsey Pogue, and we are continuing World After. Hopefully at this point, well, if you're new to the show, go back to 5 episodes or 4 episodes to season 3.5, episode 1. Start there because you'll be really confused coming in the middle of a book. So we're reading World After, the Ending Legacy prequel book. If you are listening to this in real time, like when the episode is actually posted, World After is currently free on retailers. So definitely go grab that ebook. But it's only going to be like that for a week. So, but you can always get it for free by subscribing to our email lists.
Yes.
Okay, now let's get back into the story. 11. Del. We rowed across the bay, our oars dipping, gliding, and re-emerging from the surprisingly still water in a steady rhythm. The wind from earlier in the night had died down, and a dense fog had settled over the city, dissipating to a light mist over the bay. Our heavy breathing and the water splashing against the hull of the boat sounded impossibly loud, magnified by the stillness of the night. Finn glanced over his shoulder at me as he rowed. "Say someone wanted to get into the city without going through the gates," he said, speaking the first words between us in the nearly 20 minutes since we set off from Prison Island. He returned to staring back the way we'd come. "How would they get in?" I pulled my oars through the water and narrowed my eyes. Why? The single word came out as more of a grunt than a question. "A friend of mine will be meeting us on our way to the castle," he said. I paused, rowing, my oars hovering over the shimmering gray surface of the water. "A friend?" I asked, breathless. "What friend?" Finn chuckled. "Just a friend." He tossed over his shoulder, not looking back at me this time. "Come on, princess. Don't you trust me?" I pressed my lips together and my nostrils flared as I breathed in and out through my nose. I blew out a breath and continued rowing. At this point, what did I have to lose? "There's an old sewer main that used to dump the city's waste beneath the western wall before the ancient system was repaired and we switched over to that," I told him. Part of me hoped he was deceiving me and intended to sneak an army into the city to destroy us. We were monsters, after all. We deserved it. "We still keep the old tunnel open as a potential escape route," I continued, "should the city be attacked. The mouth of the cave is easy enough to find if you are walking along the beach looking for it, but it's monitored psychically day and night." Finn tilted his head thoughtfully. "Monitored for human minds, you mean?" he clarified. I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me and cleared my throat. "Yeah, so I wouldn't recommend it to your friend unless they can shield themselves." Finn was quiet for a long moment. "That won't be a problem." I sighed, wondering what I was getting myself into, and continued. "Once your friend is in the city, they need to stick to the shadows and fog as they make their way to the castle walls. We'll meet them at the Great Raven Monument near Corvo Boulevard." Finn glanced at me over his shoulder again, flashing me a half-smile that highlighted his dimple but didn't really reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said, before returning all of his focus to the task at hand, rowing. Soon enough, we reached the docks and were back to sneaking through the city. A quick check of my pendant watch told me it was 3:30 in the morning. In a couple of hours, the sky would begin to lighten, hearkening dawn's approach. We needed to be inside Castle Corvo well before the sun rose, or I wouldn't beat the servants to my chambers and they would discover the artfully arranged pillows occupying my bed in lieu of me. Thankfully, the heavy fog masked our movements through the city. We kept our minds guarded, and with Finn's help, we easily avoided any patrolling guards. An hour after disembarking the boat, we huddled in the mouth of an alleyway along Corvo Boulevard, scoping out the faint outline of the Great Raven. The behemoth statue carved out of black granite loomed over the divided avenue, its outstretched wings sheltering the empty lanes on either side of the grassy median. Spotlights made it glow through the sheltering fog. I chewed on my lip. "I don't see anyone," I whispered. Any movement around the statue would have been obvious with the spotlights. "Where's your friend?" "Sticking to the shadows," Finn murmured. "What's our next move?" He peered up at the night sky, not quite visible through the fog. We're running out of time. I scanned the area around the Great Raven. Can you cause a destruction? Destroy it.
Yeah. Maim the castle.
Can you cause a distraction? I asked, glancing at Finn. Make some dogs howl down the lane or something? Anything to draw any watching eyes away from the monument for a minute? Finn's eyes narrowed in thought, and he nodded slowly. His stare grew distant, and a moment later, a swarm of crows took flight, invisible through the fog, but their chorus of cawing was amplified by the heavy mist. Dogs soon responded with soulful howls, and the night was suddenly filled with an orchestra of animal sounds. I reached for Finn, but stopped myself short of touching his arm. Come on, I said, voice urgent. Let's go. Finn's eyes met mine, and he nodded. I took off across the road at a dead sprint, pushing my exhausted body as hard as I ever had before. I could hear Finn behind me, close on my heel. When I reached the base of the monument, I raised my hand and pressed one huge talon on the left foot of the Great Raven into the base, waiting until it clicked, then did the same with 2 talons on the right foot. As soon as the third talon clicked into place, the sound of stone grinding on stone filled the night, and a squat opening appeared in the base of the monument, wider than it was tall. Without hesitation, I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled into the passage. Once I was at least a dozen feet in, I paused and fished the electric torch out of my bag, then turned around to face Finn. And froze, my face mere inches from the whiskered snout of an enormous cougar. My eyes opened wide, and I gulped. The cougar chuffed. Finn? I said, my voice shaky and too high. Please tell me your friend is a giant cat, and I'm not about to die. Finn's chuckle floated past the cougar. Del, meet Beast, he said. Beast, Del. The cougar, Beast, stretched his neck out toward me, his whiskers tickling my skin as he sniffed my face. I want to get sniffed by a cougar.
I know, right?
But not like right before it mauls me.
Yeah, but not before it eats your face.
Yeah. And then, without warning, he rubbed the side of his face against mine, almost like he was marking me. Finn murmured. He likes you. I couldn't help but notice the surprise in his voice. I took a shaky breath, my eyes locked with Beast's. Good, I said. Great. That's great. I cleared my throat, trying to make my voice a little less high-pitched and shaky. Finn, there should be a depression in the wall near the opening, about the size of your hand. If you push on it, the slab should slide back into place. Got it, Finn said. There was a scuffling sound as he presumably turned around to search the walls. Tentatively, I raised a hand toward Beast's snout. I held my fingers in front of his nose, letting him get used to my scent. The big cat's nose twitched, and then he rubbed his face against my fingers. My lips curved into a smile, and I scratched his scruffy jowls and along his neck. I could feel the solid muscle and sheer coiled power hidden beneath his soft fur. A low rumble started in his chest, and I became very still, thinking he was growling at me. But the rumble continued with each inhale and exhale, and one glance at his eyes, narrowed to contented slits, told me he wasn't upset. He was purring. I giggled. From behind Beast, Finn cleared his throat. I craned my neck to peer past the cougar. We're sealed in, Finn said, his voice hushed. Shall we? He gestured down the tunnel. Oh. I lowered my hand and flashed Finn a quick smile. Good, I said, and with one last glance at the deadly cat, turned my back to both of them and crawled deeper into the tunnel. Another dozen feet and a staircase of brick appeared ahead of me. The ceiling height remained the same, but after the first few awkward, crouched steps, I descended the stairs and was able to straighten. As the stairs continued farther, the ceiling angled downward, the tunnel delving underground as it followed Corvo Boulevard toward the castle wall. The tunnel exited through a hidden passage in the mausoleum of the first Corvo queen, and we snuck through the royal cemetery, hidden by the fog. When we reached the orchard, fruit trees loomed all around us, dark, menacing sentries. But then we were through, and the road encircling the castle moat was before us. As we crouched between a couple of cypress trees, I peered up at the sky. Even through the fog, I could tell it was beginning to lighten. I scanned the bridge ahead, the only way into the castle. On such a foggy night, there would be extra sentries guarding the bridge. I could already hear their footsteps as they patrolled the length of it. We would never make it across. I looked at Beast, then at Finn. I hope Beast doesn't mind water, I murmured, my voice hushed. Finn's eyes narrowed as he glanced at me sidelong. Why? He whispered. I offered him an apologetic smile. Because we're going to have to swim under the bridge, I told him. It's the only way we'll get to the castle undetected. He'll manage, Finn said with a quirk of a smile in Beast's direction. Finn held an arm out to the road. After you. I nodded once, then inhaled deeply, blowing the breath out in a slow, steady exhale. I moved carefully, placing my boots on the gravel road to make as little noise as possible. I eased down the embankment and made my way under the bridge, where I waited for Finn and Beast to join me. Beast slipped into the water first without making a single sound, save for maybe a hiss of breath. As Finn stashed his backpack and cloak in a crevasse?
I don't know. I always say crevice because saying crevasse sounds so silly sometimes.
Crevasse.
Okay. Like twirl my mustache when I say that
word. As Finn stashed his backpack and cloak in a crevice between a couple of larger rocks, I removed my own cloak and double-checked my bag to make sure it was securely shut for the swim. Side by side, Finn and I eased into the moat, moving slowly as well, attempting to keep our breathing even despite the frigid water. I swam with my head above the surface while Finn dove under, beating me to the shore. After Finn pulled himself out of the water, he held a hand out to help me climb onto the rocky embankment beside him. I started to reach for his hand, but paused, half submerged in the moat. He didn't realize what he was doing, offering his hand to me like that. He couldn't realize. Finn rolled his eyes and grabbed my hand, pulling me out of the water. Or maybe he did realize, but at that moment, he simply didn't care. I shook off my shock and led Finn and Beast around to the far side of the island. We climbed up the slope, heading for a hidden side door used by the servants. Once we were inside the castle, we slipped into the warren of secret passages and snuck up to the hallway that led to my chambers, emerging once more from behind the painting of Danny, patron of the telepaths. Finn's eyes took in everything, the painting, the lavish decor, the length and layout of the hallway. I waved a hand and nodded toward the door to my chambers. Only once we were inside and I had eased the door shut behind us did I let my guard down. I leaned back against the door, shoulders sagging and breaths ragged, and closed my eyes. What a night. When I opened my eyes again, Beast had settled near the dying embers in the fireplace, bathing himself. But it was Finn I watched, wandering around the sitting room, examining my knickknacks and tilting his head to the side to read the spines of books. It felt extremely personal, the way he was studying these little pieces of my life. Pieces of me, personal and intimate. I cleared my throat and pushed off the door, heading for the bedroom. I was cold and filthy, and we wouldn't be able to do anything for a while yet, so I figured it was worth it to wash up. Sid shifted on his stand, silently watching the newcomers with his beady eyes. Be nice, I told him as I passed by. I ducked into the washroom to run a bath, then returned to the sitting room and approached the window behind the breakfast table. When I reached the window, the shadowy outline of the Tower of Solitude was just barely visible below, near the edge of the moat. I waited for Finn to finish his circuit around the room. He paused to carry on a silent conversation with Sid, then joined me at the window. That's where he is, I told Finn, pointing to the tower. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. But we're not going to be able to get him out of there. We'll have to watch from here and wait until they move him. Finn looked at me, his eyes rounding in surprise. We? I nodded, averting my gaze to the table and wrapping my arms around my middle as a shiver racked my body. I promised to help him. I looked up, my eyes locking with Finn's. I intend to keep that promise. Beast was suddenly on his feet, his tail swishing back and forth. Incoming, Sid croaked, readjusting his wings. My eyes widened in alarm. Someone's in the hallway, Finn said, his translation unnecessary. They're heading this way. It was probably just a servant coming to ready my rooms for the morning, but you need to hide, I hissed, grabbing Finn's arm and dragging him into my bedroom, Beast trotting close behind. I led them through the bedroom and into the washroom, heading for the door to the attached dressing room. Within, there were plenty of nooks and crannies where they could hide. I shut them in the dressing room and glanced down at my sopping wet clothes, then at the tub filling with steaming water in the center of the washroom. I stripped out of my soggy clothes as quickly as possible, hiding them in the hamper, and I was just about to step into the tub when I remembered the bed. I had arranged pillows under the covers to look like me, asleep. I raced into the bedroom and yanked the pillows out from under the covers, tossing them onto the bed. I could hear the door handle in the sitting room turning as I rushed back into the washroom, eased the door shut, and sank into the tub. Water sloshed over the edge, but I barely noticed. Only one person would ever risk entering my rooms without knocking. Mother. Heart racing, I turned off the faucet and dunked my head under the water, then reemerged and sat back in the tub, closing my eyes and controlling my breathing as I tried to appear as relaxed as possible. The washroom door creaked faintly as it opened. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. Hello, Mother. You're up early, she said from the doorway. I opened my eyes, gazing at her lazily. Yes, well, I couldn't sleep. Mother sighed. It's a big day, I know, she said. The welcoming feast. I stiffened but forced my muscles to relax. My heart was suddenly pounding in fear for something entirely unrelated to the secrets I was hiding in my closet. Was the welcoming feast really today? How had I forgotten? You'll want to make a good first impression when you meet your suitors, Mother said, unaware of my inner panic. I took a breath, inhaling and exhaling as evenly as possible. Can't wait, I said, feigning indifference. I flashed Mother a tight smile and quickly turned my attention to the window on the far wall. Again, she sighed. With slow, steady steps, she entered the bathroom, perching on a squat stool near the tub. You know, she started, I couldn't sleep the night before my welcoming feast either. She rested her forearms on her knees and leaned forward. I stayed up all night planning my flight. My attention snapped back to her. You thought about running away? She laughed, the sound as musical as ever. Of course I did, she said. Here, these men were coming into my home to contend for my hand in marriage, like I was some sort of prize, as if I were a thing, not a person. She shook her head, her stare growing distant. They were coming to take away my freedom, my future. Mother let out a bitter laugh. I hated each and every one of them. But, she continued, as she let her memories flutter away, then my mother reminded me why I had to do my duty. For the strength of the dynasty, for the strength of the kingdom, and for the people whose very lives depend on that strength.
Chapter 12, Finn. I stood in Dell's dank dressing room, wearing clothes still wet from the lake. Leaning forward, I strained to hear the queen's voice through the door. You want to make a good first impression when your suitors arrive. The queen continued, but my thoughts hung on a single word. Suitors? Now that I knew Dell wasn't a servant to the princess, but that she was the princess herself, I realized that so much of the merchants and bustling outside was for her, and the suitors she'd spoken so bitterly about, the strangers coming to woo the princess, made the reality of what I'd learned in the past few hours even more jarring. No wonder Dell hadn't seemed happy about the celebration. She was about to be engaged to a stranger. My mother reminded me why I had to do my duty, the queen continued, but despite her pep talk, her voice was devoid of any motherly concern. For the strength of the dynasty, for the strength of the kingdom, and for the people whose very lives depend on that strength. I rolled my eyes. Was the queen seriously preaching to her daughter about honor and duty? Did she even know the real meaning of those words? Anger heated my chest, and all I could think was that she, the Blood Queen, as my village had coined her after learning what her rangers had done to their loved ones, was only a few yards from me. My coiled muscles hummed, and my heart hammered with the need for vengeance. I could end this here and now and let Beast tear her to pieces. Then she could never command anyone to do anything horrible ever again. After all the blood she'd spilled, it only seemed appropriate. But the thought shriveled as quickly as it had sprouted. No matter what hatred I bore the queen and the city she ruled so mercilessly, killing her would likely start a war my people could never win. Not to mention, another part of me couldn't do that to Del, even if I didn't completely trust her yet. She'd said she was going to help me, and I thought she truly meant it. Beast's tail lashed against my leg as he waited impatiently for the queen to leave. You have a long day ahead of you, the queen continued, and I heard a rustle of clothing and footsteps on the other side of the door. Think about what I said, and remember that all of this, no matter how great the cost, is for the greater good. I glared through the door at her, biting my tongue and clenching my fist tighter. After a few bated breaths, the door shut again, and I waited for the all clear. Finally, Del sighed. You can come out, she whispered, but... My hand hovered on the door handle. I need a towel, please. Second shelf nearest the door. Opening the door a smidgen to let the light in, I peered behind me at the rows of clothes, both hanging and folded along the walls of the dressing room. The closet was larger than my entire cabin back home. It would look like a hovel to Del if she ever saw it. But the moment I thought the words, I regretted them. Whatever Del was, spoiled princess, queen incumbent, heir to the Corvo dynasty that was built on fear and blood, she wasn't the princess I'd expected. And if she was telling the truth about helping Jake, then I dared to hold out a little bit of hope that she really was different. Finn, did you guys fall asleep in there? No, I said quietly. I'm coming. I grabbed 2 towels from the shelf behind me, an additional one for her hair, like my sister preferred. I'd never felt cotton so soft. Everything in Del's life was the finest and softest luxury could afford. I opened the dressing room door to the washroom, bathed in a pale blue light of dawn. Eyes averted, I walked toward the tub and cleared my throat. You'll want to make a good first impression when your suitors arrive, huh? I said, repeating her mother's words as I held the towel out to her. Del scoffed, and the water swished around her as she stood. I couldn't care less what they think of me, she grumbled. Her fingers brushed against mine as she took the towel. Pheromones. Beast could smell them wafting off me, and he made a mental note of it. Shut up, I muttered. What? Del quipped behind me. Oh, nothing. Not you. I headed back out to the sitting room to wait for her and was met by the glaring black eyes of the raven sitting on his perch just outside the door. So a raven, huh? Oh, Sid, yes, she said from inside the washroom. I could hear her scurrying around through the partially open door, rushing to dress. He doesn't bite. Hard, she added with far too much amusement. I eyed the raven closely, opening my mind to his once more. Loyalty, protection, love. He was radiating with it. Sid ruffled his feathers in reply, not so much posturing as he was letting me know he wasn't sure how he felt about me. I backed away to give him space so he could continue glaring at me from afar, and walked over to the dwindling fire. Beast followed and plopped down in front of the hearth to continue bathing himself. For this first time in my life, I envied the sound and peered down at my wet clothes. The next few hours would be cold and uncomfortable, to say the least. The washroom door opened, and when Del stepped out, she was wearing a black cotton tunic and trousers, finished with leather padding on her arms and shoulders. Her hair was wet and impossibly black, and the long ringlets hung down around her shoulders. She didn't spare me a glance as she strode through the sitting room, heading for the door we'd entered. I'll be right back. Wait here, she commanded. She paused at the door and looked back at the raven. Be nice, Sid, she said, repeating her command to him from earlier. When she stepped into the hallway and closed the door, Beast and I looked at each other. Don't ask me, I told him. Crouching down, I put another log on the embers and watched the fire flicker to life again. Dell had a hearth in her sitting room. I assumed in her bedchambers too, and her living quarters smelled of lavender and lemon. I have to pause there and say, I have a reader who makes candles sometimes for my books because she gets inspired. She's a candle maker. And she messaged me and she said that she really felt inspired. I don't know if she will or did, but she mentioned that she was inspired to make one for the Raven Queen that it's the Dell scent that smells like lavender and lemon.
Oh,
isn't that sweet?
That. Yeah.
I'll keep you posted if I hear anything about that. But I thought that was really fun.
That's really fun.
Yeah. She had gilded mirrors, a plush red settee. Remember we had this issue.
I know. I don't know.
Settee. I think it's settee. And a library larger than any I'd ever seen. I shook my head and let out a humorless laugh. Those were only some of the many glaring differences between us. I walked to the bookshelves that lined the entire wall. So many different colored spines, each one containing a story or history or adventure I would probably never read in my life, while Dell had probably read all of them. I liked reading. I devoured every book Jake and Autumn had ever given me, which was nothing compared to Dell's collection, and yet somehow I felt like I was the luckier one. Dell could read hundreds and thousands of books, but had she ever left the walls of the city? Had she ever traveled anywhere or seen anything? Was this place a prison for her, like it was for so many others? Her mother's words, still replaying in my mind, made me think so. The queen had mentioned duty, the dynasty, and the kingdom, but what about Dell? The door opened suddenly, and Dell stepped inside again, closing the door quickly behind her. Here, she walked over to me and held out a bundle of fabric in her hand. It's only a shirt, but it's all I could find. I stared at it. Take it. It's a servant's tunic, and it's dry and less conspicuous than what you're wearing. She eyed me up and down. You're welcome to use the bath too, but I couldn't find any pants, so thanks. I'll just change my shirt. I draped the clean tunic over the red cushioned ottoman beside the fire and tugged my damp shirt over my head, getting a good whiff of myself. It was probably a good thing Dell had fetched me a clean shirt. Otherwise, Jake's guards might have smelled me coming from a mile away. I stood with my dirty tunic in hand and looked at Dell. Her eyes flicked from my face to my chest, then met my eyes. If I wasn't mistaken, her cheeks were flushed. After another awkward moment, I lifted the tunic higher. What do you want me to do with this? I probably shouldn't just leave it here. Oh, she took it from me and holding it at arm's length, she hurried back into the washroom to discard it somewhere. Beast blinked up at me. He smelled pheromones in the air again, only this time they weren't only coming from me. I grinned as I pulled the shirt over my head. Kneeling back down to poke the fire, I tried and failed not to think about just how many suitors would arrive for Dell, and if any of them were staying in the castle. They'd have their hands full, that much was certain. She was going to run circles around the poor bastards. My smile broadened at the thought. Now we need to find Jake, Dell said, suddenly all business. I glanced over my shoulder as she marched through the room, gathering her hair atop her head. She disappeared into her bedchamber, complete with the grand four-post bed. When she came out again, her hair was pinned up on her head with a stick, and she had a wad of clothes in her arms. They moved him from his cell while my mother was here. He's in the castle now. I rose to my feet. Jake's in the castle? How do you know that? She began tossing what looked like silk sleeping clothes onto the floor. The whispers, she said. The whispers? Dell blinked at me and waved my question away. I frowned as I watched her grab her slippers from just inside the door of her bedroom and toss them haphazardly onto the floor, along with a belt and crimson tunic. But before we go to him, we need to pack food and supplies for when we get him out, she said, assessing her mess. Hands on her hips, she nodded in satisfaction. Screw the food, princess, I said, taking a step closer. Dell walked to her discarded satchel on the table and started unloading it. Let's just get to Jake. You don't understand, she said, whipping her head around to face me. The castle, the grounds, and the city are all swarming with guards, especially now that so many outsiders flooding the city. It won't be as easy to get out as it was for you to get in, and definitely not with Jake by your side. A guilt-ridden look flashed across her face. And he'll need food, even if you don't. There's no saying if they've fed him at all while he's been here. Her eyes shifted over me again, assessing me this time. Besides, when was the last time you ate something? I shrugged. I hadn't thought about food in a while. In fact, it was the absolute last thing on my mind. But I knew Dell was right. What she didn't say was that we had no way of knowing what the Queen and her guards had done to Jake since Dell had last seen him. I thought of the poor souls in the prison, their blood being drained from their bodies as if they were nothing more than blood bags themselves. We didn't know if Jake would be conscious when we found him, let alone dehydrated, half-starved, or coherent for the journey home. Okay, I said, feeling my insides churn with apprehension as I processed all the unknowns. Supplies, and then what? Dell lifted her shoulder as she bit the inside of her cheek. We follow the whispers until we find him. I still didn't know what she meant by whispers, but I didn't bother questioning her about it. And if Jake's with the Queen, or if he's surrounded by guards, it was one thing to be outside, where I could draw upon animal friendlies to help me scout and sense things, but here in the castle, Beast was just as much of an eyesore as I was. There was no sneaking around the castle for 140-pound cat, much less a ginger, shaggy-haired woodland kid who looked distinctly out of place. We'll have to figure that out when we get to it, Dell said regretfully. For now, we take the hidden passages to the pantry and get some food and water for the trip home. Mother's an early riser, and now that she's awake, more of the servants will be waking to attend to her. Soon the final preparations for the welcoming feast will begin, and the castle will be swarming with people. We don't have much time. I hated to be the pessimistic one who asked too many questions, but I was out of my element here inside the castle, where, despite the enormity of the place, it felt claustrophobic. Won't someone notice you're gone and come looking for you? That's what this is for, she said, and made a sweeping gesture at the mess of clothes on the floor. I made it look like I changed into my sparring clothes for an early morning session, she explained. It will buy us a little more time, but if I don't leave a mess, they'll know something is off. My eyebrows rose of their own accord. Dell was a messy rebel princess who could fight, think on her feet, wasn't afraid to get dirty, and heard whispers, whatever that meant. I was more and more intrigued by the second. Clever. Lifting the strap of her satchel over her head, Dell draped it around her and walked over to Sid. He ruffled his feathers as he glared at her from his perch. Don't worry, she told him, a sudden pep in her voice that hadn't been there before. I'm not leaving you behind again. She held out her arm and Sid sidled up her shoulder, his talons scraping against the leather guards on her clothes. As the raven settled into place on her shoulder, he puffed up his breast, eyeing me closely. I eyed him back. He was a protective bird, I'd give him that. Dell nodded toward the door. Come on, she said, and grabbed a woven bag from the hook by the door. She shoved it into her satchel. The coast is clear, I told her, knowing Beast sensed no one in the hall. Slowly, Dell opened the door and peeked out, and when she confirmed there was no one about, we hurried into an adjoining hallway. The rising sun filtered through the tall arched windows, illuminating the portraits and maps decorating the brocade wallpaper. My skin crawled as the likeness of my ancestors stared down at me from the wall. Even if their likenesses weren't exact, that their images were hanging on the castle walls was unsettling. Did the Queen truly believe she was doing what her patrons would have wanted by draining innocent people's blood, or that the originals would condone her warping their beliefs? The teachings of my ancestors built upon endless sacrifices into whatever the Queen needed them to be to suit her purpose. As before, Beast and I followed Dell back into the narrow secret passageways by way of a portrait of Danny and her dog, Jack, and we were encased in darkness again. It smelled of must and was cool like the tunnels under the prison without the bright sun to warm the halls, but Dell navigated the passageways expertly, even without her electric torch. You used these a lot, then? Yes, she said absently, as we passed a few doors that led to rooms and places I would never visit. We passed holes in the walls that allowed pinpricks of light to filter in, and I glanced through a few as we walked by, peeking into meeting rooms and a couple of empty bedrooms, It was easy enough to guess that this was how the queen and her minions spied on her guests, how she learned their secrets and used them to bend everyone to her will when she wasn't plucking their thoughts from their minds herself. After a few more minutes of walking in silence, the sense and sights of what Beast could detect filling my mind, Dell turned a sharp corner and came to a stop. "The cellar is just ahead," she whispered. "Is it empty?" Beast sensed no one, but he did smell food. "It's empty," I told her. Quietly, Dell pushed the narrow door open and stepped down into a cellar. Beast and I halted behind her, eyeing the shelves of bread and sacks of grain, rows of ceramic jugs and glass bottles. The scent of cured meats accosted me, and I could practically feel Beast's mouth watering. I peered up at the lobs of meat hanging from the rafters. Dell pulled the woven bag from her satchel, then grabbed a loaf of bread and shoved it into her bag. "Grab a few for Beast," she said, glancing up at the lamb shanks hanging above us. "But he better eat fast." She disappeared into an adjacent room, leaving us to our own devices. Beast and I looked at each other, and he licked his lips. I reached up and untied a string of cured lamb shanks, then set it on the ground in front of him. The entire cellar reverberated with his instant purring. Leaving Beast to his feast, I followed Dell into the kitchen. She cut a chunk of cheese from the wheel on the counter and grabbed a piece of cloth from the basket that hung from a tether above her. Then she looked at me. "Have some," she said, glancing at the wheeled cheese. "It's Mother's favorite, so you know it's the best in the kingdom." I wasn't sure if it was disdain for her mother or just a right statement, but I was having a difficult time understanding how different Dell was. But I was having a difficult time understanding how different Dell was from what I'd expected. I cut a slice of cheese and licked my lips. "How is it," I started, and popped it into my mouth, "that you are so different from the woman who raised you, your own flesh and blood? Jake wasn't my father by blood, but I still had pieces of him in all that I was." "Who said she raised me?" Dell muttered, and wrapped the cheese chunk in a cloth. There were plenty of servants to do that for her. She put the bundle into her bag with a loaf of bread and continued to buzz around the kitchen. I cut off another cheese slice, feeling my stomach rumble with greed. "How is it?" Dell asked, glancing at me as she filled her deerskin with water from a barrel. "It tastes like cheese," I said with a swallow. Dell laughed and nodded toward the cellar. "Is he almost ready? We should go." I silently called Beast into the kitchen and glanced around for a bowl to fill with water for him to drink, but Dell beat me to it. "He can use this one," she said with a smirk, and she reached for a large, well-used pot hanging above the giant gas stove and walked over to the water barrel. "It's Berta's favorite." "Berta?" "The head cook, and she's my least favorite of the kitchen staff." "Really? Well, who is your favorite?" I asked, leaning against the counter. I cut another sliver of cheese. "Lucian, the pastry chef. He lets me hang out with him and sample whatever pastries he's working on." I smirked. "He sounds like a good friend to have." "He is. Mother hates it. Says too many sweets aren't good for me, but what's she going to do?" Dell shrugged. "Berta, on the other hand, takes Mother's orders very seriously, and Berta hates Sid. Says he's a vermin and too unclean to be in the kitchen, which makes me despise her even more." Dell set the half-full pot on the ground at her feet for Beast to drink from, and he began lapping up water happily. "So," Dell continued, turning to face me fully with a glint in her eyes, "sometimes when Sid and I sneak down here in the middle of the night, I have some of the chocolates Lucian keeps for me, and I fill this very pot, heat it on the stove for a moment, and then let Sid enjoy a lukewarm bath in it. You know, because he's so unclean." The chuckle in my throat surprised me, and I leaned my elbows on the counter, studying Dell in the muted morning light. "And now the cougar drinks from it as well." I tisked and shook my head. With a big, beautiful smile, Dell shrugged. "I'm a rebel. What can I say?" "Yeah, you are," I admitted, wondering how I could have been so wrong about her. "I like it." Dell's posture straightened and her eyes and her easy smile wavered. I hadn't planned to voice the thought. I hadn't even known I was thinking it until the words were out there, too late to take back. "So we should probably find Jake," I said with a thick swallow. "Yes, we should do that," Dell answered in a rush. I lifted the cloth wadded up beside the cheese wheel and laid it over the top as if we hadn't been there at all. Then went over to the pot of water where Beast was cleaning his muzzle with his paw. "Leave it," Del said as I reached for the pot. When I looked at her, she was grinning. "She'll be so confused." I chuckled again, knowing Del and I could definitely be friends in another life. She nodded toward the cellar, and I followed her back into the labyrinth of passages. After Beast was inside with us, I closed the door behind him and turned, nearly running into Del. The food bag in her hand was all that was between us. "The whispers were louder by my quarters," Del started quietly. "So we'll head back that way and see where they lead." I nodded, staring at the shadows of her face in the darkness. Even though I couldn't see her eyes, I could feel them on me, and fleetingly, I thought about everything I'd learned about Del in the hours I'd known her. Then I thought about all the things I didn't yet know but wanted to. "Thank you, Princess, for doing all this." I felt my chest warm as I realized how much I really meant those words. It wasn't lost on me how bad off I would probably be without her help. I'd come into the city to scout things out, with only determination and my abilities to guide me. Now, I wasn't only close to getting Jake out of here, but Del had shown me more kindness than I'd ever imagined was possible from the princess of the Corvo dynasty. "This wasn't what I expected to find when I came here," I admitted. "You aren't what I expected." Del licked her lips and shoved the food bag into my chest. "Don't worry about it. It's the least I can do," she said, and then she turned and headed back down the passageway, the same way we'd come. As we continued down the narrow corridors and around a few corners, I told myself that whatever I was feeling for her was gratitude and surprise, nothing more. Del was the princess, after all, and after we found Jake, I would never see her again. "Oh no," Del muttered, her voice hoarse with unease. She made a final veer to the right and stopped at a slender door with an ornate handle. "He's in here," she whispered harshly. Beast could smell him. "He's beyond the wall, and he's alone." Del peered back at me, disappointment, or maybe it was apprehension in her eyes. "It's Mother's study," she explained. I didn't pretend to know what the significance of that was or to understand the emotions playing over Del's face. "Be prepared," she said, so quietly I barely heard her. "Be prepared for what?" But Del didn't answer me as she heaved a deep breath and turned the handle. The door squeaked open, and I was almost too scared to look, uncertain what I would find. But once I stepped into the room, I couldn't look away. A brightly colored mural of Del's patrons covered every bit of exposed wall between the bookshelves and paintings that lined them. Danny and Zoe and Jason, Becca and Harper, even Jake himself, all of them were etched on the walls, carrying out daily tasks. Their likenesses were uncanny, and their images were big and vibrant as they looked down at us. Marble busts of them sat on shelves interspersed between books, and pages of writing were in cases situated throughout the room. This wasn't a study. It was more like a shrine, and Jake sat in the center of it as he stared up at all the lifelike faces. "Jake," I said calmly. I could only imagine what thoughts filled his head as his past life surrounded him, but he didn't move or say a word. "Jake," I repeated, and Beast and I walked cautiously over to him. Beast licked Jake's hand as I stepped around the chair to face him. His clothes were dirty, but otherwise he seemed whole. He didn't look drained or depleted in any physical way. He wasn't even restrained. His jaw was hard set, as always, and his 5 o'clock shadow a little more grown, but it was his eyes that stunned me. Their amber depths were dull and lifeless. "Jake," I said more firmly this time. Under the encroaching fear, I didn't sound like Finley the boy, but Finn the man. "Look at me," I demanded. But Jake stared straight ahead, completely oblivious, like he couldn't even hear me. He didn't move. He didn't even blink.
13. Del. I paused just inside Mother's study, watching Finn approach Jake. I had thought, or at least I had hoped, the whispers might fall silent as soon as we found him, as Finn and Jake were reunited and their escape was within sight. But the whispers were louder than ever. So loud I had to fight the urge to cover my ears with my hands. Not that it would do much good. Finn whispered Jake's name, but Jake kept staring at the mural of the patrons, his expression empty, his eyes vacant. If it weren't for the steady rise and fall of Jake's chest, I might have thought he was dead. Look at me, Finn said, grasping Jake's shoulder and shaking him. Jake, look at me. Dread was a leaden lump in my gut. According to the discussion I had overheard between Mother and Advisor Malar, Mother wanted Jake above all other healers for the purity of his blood, but also because she thought he might be able to lead her to more first-generation healers, more people for her to imprison, damning them to life as blood slaves. And I knew Mother too well to have to guess the rest. She had delved into Jake's mind in search of the answers he refused to give, but she had prodded with such force that he had retreated deep within his own memories. Jake was lost within his own mind, a prisoner of his past. Finn wouldn't be able to wake him. Nobody would be able to wake him, save for another empath, a specific kind of empath. An empath like me. Hesitantly, I stepped forward, closing the distance between Finn and me. This wouldn't be easy. Resting my hand on Finn's tense shoulder, I closed my eyes and breathed through a shudder as his fear and desperation flooded me. It took seconds, eons, to get a grip on the sudden influx of feelings. Opening my eyes, I cleared my throat and licked my lips. Finn, I said, my voice tightened by the intensity of his emotions. When he didn't respond, I squeezed his shoulder and repeated his name, louder and with more force. Finn! He tore his stare from Jake's face, but remained crouched before the unresponsive man. His friend, his family. There was more love shared between these two than had ever been possible between Mother and me. The kingdom had always come first with Mother, and it would continue to come first until the day she died. Or until I did. What's wrong with him? Finn asked, demanded. He swallowed roughly. Why won't he respond? Because he can't hear you, I said, sympathy softening my voice. He's not here, not really. At Finn's incredulous look, I explained. He's lost, deep within the labyrinth of his own mind. Finn's expression darkened and his rage poured into me through my touch, expounded by his hatred for Mother and everything she stood for. He blamed Mother for this. How could he not? Even he could surmise that this was her doing. Overwhelmed by his animosity, I removed my hand from his shoulder, focusing on the floor and taking slow, deep breaths to calm myself. After one last deep breath, I returned my focus to Finn. I can help Jake, I told Finn. We can help him. I glanced over my shoulder at the study's main door. Mother wouldn't leave Jake attended in here for long. Mother wouldn't leave Jake unattended in here for long. But we have to hurry, I added. Finn clenched his jaw, his nostrils flaring. What do we do? I held my breath, extending my open hand to Finn. All you have to do is trust me, I said. Let down all of your mental barriers, and whatever you do, don't let go. I gulped. We were about to dive into Jake's mind, to hunt him down, and it wouldn't do anyone any good for both Jake and Finn to end up lost within Jake's memories. We're only going to get one shot at this, I told him. Finn narrowed his eyes at me. One shot at what? He asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Shifting my focus to Jake, I studied his slack expression and vacant eyes. At helping Jake escape from whatever memory he's trapped himself within, I finally said. I looked at Finn. He was staring at my hand. An internal battle seemed to be waging within him. After a long moment, Finn's shoulders squared, and he placed his hand in mine, his fingers engulfing my hand. His palms were surprisingly rough, the calluses unyielding against my skin. I stared at him for a moment longer. Finn trusted me. The proof was right here in my hand. I blinked, stunned by the realization, and shifted my attention to Jake. With a deep breath, I raised my other hand, gently pressing my palm against Jake's temple, and the world melted away around us.
14. Finn. The warmth of Dell's hand was all that tethered me to where I stood as my thoughts swirled with foreign images and soul-stirring emotions. I could still feel the lingering presence of the Queen's consciousness in Jake's mind, like seared burns festering on delicate skin. She'd been searching for answers, but she hadn't found them. She needed Jake, but more than that, she needed more people like him. She needed originals with pure, undiluted healer blood. But in her desperation to get answers from Jake's mind, the queen had poked and prodded too deeply. She'd stirred awake the most precious, protected part of Jake's mind, the place where he stored memories that were so raw they were crippling. Lives I'd never lived before flashed through my mind, each of them shredding parts of my soul, sucking my consciousness deeper into Jake's mind along with him. Jake sat in the living room with Zoe, nestled next to him on a couch, swaddling a newborn baby in her arms. But it wasn't only happiness in Jake's mind. There was longing, too. With shimmering, jewel-blue eyes, Zoe looked up at him, more real and striking than any painting or image I'd ever seen of her. She has Harper's smirk, she said with a smile, and Chris's nose. But whose ability will she have? His prophecy, or will she be a mind healer like her mother? Zoe's smile broadened. If they're lucky, maybe both. But as Zoe said the words, her openness and ease faltered, and darkness shadowed her eyes. Am I crazy for wanting this? She whispered, even as terrifying as pregnancy in these days, and how freaked out I get every time. I still want this. Zoe's cheeks reddened and her eyes clouded with tears, and as the love of his life yearned for a child of her own, Jake's heart broke for her. He tightened his arms around Zoe's shoulders and pressed a kiss to her temple. No, it's not weird, he said, forcing the same disappointment from his voice. Things get more uncertain by the day. Soon there might not be a safe place to raise a child. Maybe it's better this way. Reluctantly, Zoe nodded against his chest, and Jake squeezed her tighter. The memories swirled, and once again Zoe's face came into view. Only this time she had a baby belly and a mixture of fear and happiness in her eyes. Then everything changed again. Becca, the patron of oracles, was lying in a bed in a nondescript bunker, blood smeared on her face. Jake crouched at her bedside. It would always come to pass, she rasped. You have always known it. They will eradicate us all out of fear. All of you. She took a ragged breath. You must keep moving. You cannot stay. Do you understand? Becca gritted out the last words and gasped for breath. Jake nodded as he took Becca's hand in his. Zoe lost to tears beside him. Every beaten up, exhausted part of Jake hardened with anger as he watched his sister take her final breath. Again. Twice he'd watched her die. Twice he'd failed her. And once again, they were running from power-hungry bastards who would never let them rest. The Regions were gone. Becca was the last of them. And it was only a matter of time before the rest of his people suffered the same fate, unless Jake could stop it. Goosebumps rippled over my skin as a swirl of elation filled me, and the images shifted. Jake stood with Zoe, her hair streaked with gray and hanging in long waves around her shoulders. In front of them was a couple standing in a field of green. An old man with an eye patch stood before them. I think even Grayson has a tear in his eye, Zoe whispered, and she glanced at Jake. A lock of hair hung over a scar on her temple. Or he squeezed her with a nod of contentment. I totally made up my own sentence there. Grayson cleared the emotion from his throat. And do you, Hope Anna Vaughn, take this man to be your husband? His words trailed to nothing as Jake stared at his daughter, tall like her mother, with long raven black hair that curled down her back. An indescribable pride and heart-aching affection filled him. How was it possible there was still a man left in the world Jake believed was worthy of his only daughter, his and Zoe's little miracle? I wish, Zoe breathed, and she wrapped her arm around Jake's waist. I wish Dad were here to see his granddaughter on the happiest day of her life. She peered up at him, eyes watery but bright with happiness, despite the pain she tried to hide from him. The years had been harsh, and unlike Jake, whose body felt no effects of a lifetime of running and fighting, Zoe's did. She wore the years like badges of honor, wrinkles and scars alike, and he loved her all the more for it, as he pushed the reality he knew would come sooner than he could bear from his mind. My God, that would be so hard. Jesus. In an attempt to stifle the impending heartache, Jake leaned in and kissed the scar on his wife's temple and rested his cheek against her head. Your dad's here, he promised. Both of your parents are. He saw Anna in the ever-present twinkle in Hope's teal eyes and Tom's crooked smile whenever she laughed. I could feel the world slipping away from Jake, along with his control, as a fleeting image of Zoe on her deathbed flashed into his mind. Her face was deadly.
Deadly
Her
face.
face was deeply lined with age. Her blue-green eyes wary. You have to protect them, she said, as he cradled her in his arms. Silent tears streamed down her face as her voice caught in her throat. He tried to be strong for her, always, but everything inside him was breaking, his heart, his hope, his control. Promise me, Jake, she said with a gulp. They're all we have left, our legacy. Promise me you'll keep them safe. Her voice was brittle and her eyes clouded with pain and sadness. Jake leaned forward and kissed her lips to stifle a sob, his heart hammering in his chest as he swallowed an all-consuming sadness he knew would forever change him. I will, he whispered. I promise you, always. I felt Jake's anguish like it was alive inside me, tearing at me, pulling me under a rushing current of longing and fear and exhaustion until I couldn't breathe. I tore my hand from Dell's hold. I can't, I choked out, shaking my head, and I took a faltering step away from them. Dell's eyes were wide and filled with tears, and I hadn't let go of her hand for more than a second when the study door cracked open and the narrowed, beautifully etched scowl of the queen herself was staring back at us.
That is where we're going to stop for this episode. There will be one more episode of this season, so we'll finish up World After next time. So until then, happy reading.
Happy reading.